A lot of people have been asking me how much did my house cost and what is the process for buying a house in Spain. Firstly, I'll go through how you buy a house in Spain. When you look in these Spanish villages, or probably the same in Italy and rural France, often a lot of the places are technically for sale. They're abandoned, they haven't been lived in for 20 to 100 years or something like that. No one's living in them, someone owns them, and they would probably happily part with that old property for cash. However, they don't feel that those properties are worth anything. There isn't much of a market for these old properties. So the reality is they're never on the market, they're never advertised because they just don't have it in their mind to do so. So one of the challenging things is actually finding the property that you want to buy. And the only real way of doing that is just spending time in the area and going around and looking and inquiring and asking. And obviously that's difficult if you have poor language skills. How I bought my house is, I had some friends known for a long time. They actually came out, they moved to Spain into a spare room. I had an apartment and they stayed here for the last 4 years. And in the process of that time, they moved around a bunch and then they end up buying a place next door to the place I have bought. So when I was visiting them, I'm like looking at the house and looking at the barn. Oh, I don't know. Like the reason I bought a place at all is because I basically needed workshop space and some studio space. This is what I've been working towards. I looked at some industrial unit options, but it was kind of a hassle. It's quite difficult to find ones in the right locations with like what I would need to make like a kind of a van hangout in an industrial place. It wasn't really working, and there's some bureaucracy involved in assigning it to a specific business license and stuff. I just didn't really want to deal with that. And then I thought, well, I could rent a house. It's quite cheap to rent a place in Spain. And then it's like, well, but I'm paying rent the whole time when I'm not using it. So I'm like, okay, well, why don't I just buy somewhere? Now, the housing market in these places is kind of slow. It might take you 2 or 3 years to sell your property. So it's not like an immediately releasable asset. So on that basis, if I'm going to buy somewhere, I might as well buy someone which has long-term potential. So that's why when I looked at the barn again and it's got this house, I'm like, well, I guess the barn, we've got a lot of workshop space and it's got a little bit of land. If they were both done up, I'll never ever need more than that in my entire life. I can't imagine why I would need more than that. It's already a lot. So in my mind it was like, well, if I can buy this and I can renovate it and maybe renovate them both, then I just jump to the top of the housing ladder. I don't have to do a housing ladder of renovations and life drain or anything like that. I don't have to have the cost of every time I sell and buy a house. I don't have to do so much mortgage stuff and life admin in my life. I can just go straight to the top, job done. Own a house. If everything goes wrong, I can just move there and eat pasta. So basically, the guy who owned my house, he never lived there. No one's lived there for 20 years, but he used the garden for gardening and growing vegetables, and he lived in a nearby town. So I just hung out and waited till he went gardening. And when he went gardening, I went to speak to him. We talked about price a little bit. We agreed a price for the house and barn. He had some other land he wanted to bundle in, but I didn't even look at it, didn't want it, didn't need it. So basically we agreed a price. And then this is when the things start moving. Firstly, it's probably pretty useful, unless you have extremely good Spanish and understanding of the legal system, to get a decent lawyer. I got a lawyer recommended by a friend. She was based in London, not the cheapest, but very good, very thorough, and spoke perfect English and Catalan and Spanish, and could also she was also dual qualified. So essentially I knew that, okay, it's a little bit more expensive to hire someone who's very good and based in London and dual qualified, but it takes most of the risk of buying a property out of the equation. So then you have the process. So to buy a property in Spain, like the kind of almost the deal is done by a private contract, which happens before the actual sale. So the actual process before that is you get a lawyer, they get a lawyer. Now, old mate who I bought the house from, he didn't want a lawyer, he just wanted to go to a notario. However, there's a lot of paperwork, you need to get the land stuff, my lawyer needs to check out all the land boundaries and understand what's going on, what plan and permission uses you have for different things, habitation certificates and all of this stuff. So my lawyer needs all this stuff, and he's a kind of slightly deaf guy who can't really use his mobile phone. So what we ended up doing is we found another lawyer who our friends knew, and we took him to that lawyer, and she's obviously said the right things and he represented her, because otherwise it'd been a real pain. So my lawyer can talk to her, and he can go in and toddle in and visit her and do some paperwork and give her stuff and understand what's going on. And it was also good that he was represented properly as well. So it's fair, pretty easy deal. So that dragged on a bit because there's a few bits of information which came out to do with like the land boundaries, which weren't quite obvious and stuff like that. And that took a little bit of time to do. And also I wanted to check out what my permissions would be and things like that. And obviously I don't know what's going on. I don't understand the legal system. So I'm a little bit more hesitant than maybe I would be if I was going to buy another place here, which probably won't. But I was probably more particular on detail than I needed to be, but that's what made me okay with the whole purchase. So as that dragged on, and then essentially we got to a point when we were ready to sign the ARAS, which is like the private contract. And in the private contract you pay 10%, usually you can decide how much it is, but you pay 10% of the property price to the seller. And basically if you pull out now, you lose that 10% deposit, and if he pulls out, he pays you back twice. So it's a lot nicer than say in the UK, where until the ink is dry on the paper, someone can basically gazump you, say, oh, I'll give you 10 grand more, boom, it's all off the table, you've done all the work for the lawyers, you've done all of this stuff, you've got ready to sell your house, and then someone offers more money and the seller just pulls the plug. Here you pay that ARAS, and okay, if it all goes wrong, well, they have to pay you twice back. Okay, you get 10% of your property price out of it, it'll be a pain, but you're protected kind of from that point. So then it doesn't matter if you invest more money into a lawyer, more money into stuff. Basically you have an agreement in the private contract which says what they need to deliver and the date you're going to come up with the money and pay. So they might have to sort out some more paperwork or something like that, or redefine land boundaries, or get specific documents redone or whatever, especially if it's an old property, they might not be up to date. So they might have to do that, and then you have the date and you go to the notario. The notario is like an official who will basically witness, he'll read out the contracts to you in this little sort of ceremony thing, and then you sign your paperwork. And at that point you hand over a banker's draft. So a banker's draft is basically like a bank check sort of thing, which is made out to that person, has to be spelt right and all this stuff, and you just go to bank. It wasn't too hard, just went to the bank, told them what I need in the worst Spanish. I am learning fairly fast now, but at that point I knew nothing. Bad Spanish, got a banker's draft, and then carried on. So that's the process of buying a house. It's worth noting that before that, in the process, you also need to get yourself an NIE number, which is like a foreign resident number, and a bank account here, because you need to pay for the final lump sum from your bank account. So there's also the tax to pay. So when you buy a property, you have to pay a tax, and that's 10%. There's also like some kind of like other tax, but normally the seller pays it. So basically you have to pay the property tax, which is about 10% of the value, and there's another like fee which ideally the seller pays, and they pay it afterwards, and they have to agree in your private contract to pay that fee. If for some reason they renege on it, technically it's down to you, but they should pay it, and on the basis of your private contract, under law and stuff, they will. To get an NIE number, there's two ways. One, my lawyer offered that it could be done in London. If I sent copies of my passport and stuff, they could just sort it out before, like in London with the embassy. But I was already in Spain, so I just got myself padroned here at my friend's house. And the padron is like, you go to the Ajuntament, you say, I'm living here, you have like a rental contract, or your friend who owns the property to kind of vouch for it. Now you have a padron, which says you live there. And then you can go to a police station with your padron, and you go through the NIE process. So you fill in a form, you bring your passport, documents and stuff like that, and then they will give you a sort of slip to take to the bank, and you pay them 12 euros or something. You come back with a receipt, and then in 2 or 3 days they'll have your NIE number. So that's relatively straightforward, and it does help if you can speak the language. Once you have your NIE number, you can get your bank account. So I got my bank account at CaixaBank. It was pretty straightforward. I needed to have a copy. I had a digital copy of my NIE paper from the police, and also I needed to have sort of P45s and P60s and documents from my tax, my UK based tax numbers, obviously passport, and a bunch of other stuff. They'll tell you what you need, but it's worth to know that you need a copy of or the actual paper of your NIE, and you also need to have your P45 and copies of that for them to basically connect you to other tax systems for, I guess, tax avoidance oversight. Once you have a bank account, obviously you can transfer money in and ready for when you actually buy the property with a banker's draft from the same bank. So that's the process of buying a house in a nutshell. So the price I paid for my property, so it comes with a little yellow house, which is 3 stories, and it was last renovated about 50 years ago, wasn't lived in for 20 years. So you can imagine the general state of the repairs and the fittings. So basically it's a full guttering renovation job. Pretty much nothing apart from the floors and the walls will remain by the time I finished. All of the internal walls are gone, all of the bathrooms, all of the fittings, all of the plumbing, all the electric, and the roof. So big job. So that's a bit of a junk show. It come with a big barn, which is again, if you were going to renovate it, you're just doing everything, but it's a cool position in a most amazing place. If you had tried to buy somewhere with the same comparable beauty in the UK, it's going to be National Trust land or Lake District, and even as a junk show it costs you £1 million. It's just unbelievable good value for money compared with, say, UK property market. And it has a few terraces of land which has been used for vegetable gardens, and it's got a load of beautiful mature fruit trees, which is incredible. Actually, let's just look out the window. So I paid 80,000 euros for the house, barn and land, which was split in a certain way. I think it was 3,000 for the land and 20,000 for the barn and the rest on the house. I paid about 10,000 euros in tax going through a tax agent, so there's probably a bit of a fee there. So that's it. If you've got any questions about this process, I'll try and answer them. Just put them in the comments below and I'll answer them as I can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.